Detective James Carter never planned on becoming a cop. Growing up on the rough streets of Detroit, he saw plenty of police officers, but most of them didn't inspire much confidence. His neighborhood was the kind of place where people looked out for each other because they couldn't always count on anyone else to do it. His father ran a small corner store, working 14-hour days just to keep the lights on. James remembered being 12 years old, watching 3 guys rob the store while he hid behind the counter. His dad handed over everything in the register without a fight. The police came 2 hours later, took a report, and that was the last they heard about it. No follow-up, no arrests, just another file in a drawer somewhere. But there was one officer who was different. Officer Rodriguez used to walk the beat every afternoon, and he actually knew people's names. He'd stop and talk to the kids playing basketball, check in on the elderly folks sitting on their porches, and somehow he always seemed to know when something was wrong. When James's little sister got sick and they couldn't afford her medicine, Officer Rodriguez showed up at their door with a bag of groceries and somehow connected them with a clinic that could help. That moment changed everything for James. He realized that one person who actually cared could make a real difference. He decided right then that he wanted to be that person for someone else. James joined the police academy when he was 25 years old. His mother cried when he told her, but not from happiness. She was terrified. She'd seen too many young men from their neighborhood end up on the wrong side of the law, and too many cops who treated everyone like criminals. She made him promise that he'd never forget where he came from, and that he'd always remember what it felt like to be on the other side. He never forgot that promise. The academy was tough, but James had something a lot of the other recruits didn't have. He understood the communities they were supposed to serve. While other officers saw suspects, James saw people who reminded him of his neighbors, his cousins, his friends from school. That perspective made him a different kind of cop. His first few years on the force were a learning experience. He made mistakes like everyone does, but he also made a name for himself as someone who did things by the book. When he made an arrest, it stuck. Defense attorneys hated going up against his cases because everything was documented, every witness was credible, and every piece of evidence was collected properly. But what really set James apart was that he treated everyone with respect. It didn't matter if someone was a victim or a suspect, rich or poor. He talked to people like they were human beings. That simple act opened doors that other detectives couldn't get through. People trusted him. They told him things they wouldn't tell other cops. By the time James hit his mid-40s, he'd solved hundreds of cases. Not the easy ones either. He specialized in the cases that seemed impossible, the ones that had gone cold, the ones that other detectives had given up on. He had this ability to see patterns that others missed, to ask the right questions, to follow leads that seemed like dead ends but somehow broke cases wide open. His captain used to joke that James had a sixth sense for finding the truth. But it wasn't magic. It was just hard work, attention to detail, and a refusal to give up on people who deserved answers. James lived in a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood with his wife, Lisa, who worked as a teacher. They had 2 daughters, both in high school, both smart as whips and constantly challenging him to be better. His older daughter wanted to be a lawyer, and his younger one was passionate about social justice. They kept him grounded, reminded him why he did what he did. He wasn't flashy. He drove an old sedan that had seen better days. He didn't care about promotions or politics. He just wanted to do good work and go home to his family. On weekends, he coached youth basketball at the community center, the same one where he used to play as a kid. He saw himself in those kids, and he wanted them to know that there were people who believed in them. Young officers in the department looked up to James. They asked him for advice, studied his case files, and tried to learn from his methods. He was always willing to teach, always patient with questions, and he never acted like he was above anyone. He remembered what it was like to be the new guy, uncertain and trying to prove himself. The community knew him too. When he walked through neighborhoods during investigations, people would come up and talk to him. They'd offer information, share concerns, or just say hello. That trust was something he'd built over decades, one interaction at a time. James had received awards and commendations over the years, but he kept them in a drawer at home. They weren't why he did the job. He did it because he believed that justice mattered, that every victim deserved someone fighting for them, and that the system only worked when people took it seriously. He had rules he lived by. Never cut corners. Never assume guilt. Always follow the evidence wherever it leads. Never let pressure from above compromise the investigation. Never forget that behind every case was a real person whose life had been turned upside down. For 22 years, James Carter had been the kind of cop that people pointed to when they wanted to believe the system could work. He was proof that integrity and dedication still meant something. His career was a testament to the idea that one person doing the right thing, day after day, year after year, could actually make a difference. He went to bed every night, knowing he'd done honest work. He looked his daughters in the eye and felt proud of the example he was setting. He shook hands with victims' families and meant it when he said he'd do everything in his power to get them answers. James Carter had built his entire career on justice, on doing things the right way no matter what. His reputation was spotless. His record was beyond question. He was, by every measure, exactly the kind of police officer that every community deserves. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. And sometimes one moment of weakness, one decision made under impossible pressure, can unravel everything a person has spent a lifetime building. James didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. James was finishing up paperwork from a burglary case when his captain walked into the detective bullpen with a look that made everyone go quiet. Something was wrong. You could feel it in the air. A 16-year-old girl named Sophie Miller hadn't come home from school the day before. She'd texted her mom that she was leaving late because of volleyball practice and then nothing. No more texts, no calls. Her phone went straight to voicemail. By midnight, her parents had called the police, frantic with worry. James felt his stomach drop when he heard the details. Missing teenager cases always hit different. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of a good outcome. Everyone in the room knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. The captain assigned the case to James. It wasn't a question or a request. When something this serious came up, James was the one they trusted. He grabbed his jacket and headed out before the captain even finished talking. Sophie's parents were devastated. Her mother couldn't stop crying, and her father looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. They showed James photos of Sophie, a bright-eyed kid with her whole life ahead of her. Honor student, volleyball captain, volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, the kind of daughter every parent hopes to raise. James spent the first 72 hours barely sleeping. He interviewed Sophie's friends, her teachers, her coaches. He pulled traffic camera footage from every street between the school and her house. He went through her social media accounts, her text messages, everything. He was looking for any clue, any pattern, anything that might tell him what happened. The media got hold of the story by day 3. Local news crews set up outside the police station. Sophie's mother went on television, begging for anyone with information to come forward. Her face was everywhere, on posters, on websites, on the evening news. The whole city was watching, waiting, hoping. The pressure was intense. The mayor's office called twice a day for updates. The police chief wanted briefings every morning. Parents across the city were terrified, keeping their own kids closer, demanding answers. James understood their fear. He had daughters too. He couldn't imagine what Sophie's parents were going through. On day 5, James caught a break. A witness came forward, a woman who'd been driving home from work. She remembered seeing a girl matching Sophie's description, talking to someone in a dark blue sedan near the school. The woman couldn't see the driver clearly, but she remembered thinking it seemed odd because the girl looked uncomfortable. James pulled records for every dark blue sedan registered in the area. There were hundreds. He started running down the list, checking owners, looking for anyone with a criminal history. That's when he found Tyler Bennett. Bennett was 34 years old with a record. 5 years earlier, he'd been convicted of assault. He'd served 2 years and been out on parole for 3. He drove a dark blue sedan. He lived less than 2 miles from Sophie's school. And when James looked deeper, he found that Bennett worked part-time at a warehouse right next to the school's parking lot. Everything pointed to Bennett. The proximity, the vehicle, the history. James brought him in for questioning, and from the moment Bennett sat down, something felt off. He was nervous, defensive, couldn't keep his story straight. He claimed he'd been home alone the day Sophie disappeared. No witnesses, no alibi. Just his word. James interviewed Bennett for hours. He pushed, he probed, he asked the same questions different ways. But Bennett wouldn't crack. He denied everything, said he'd never even seen Sophie, claimed the police were harassing him because of his past. His lawyer showed up and shut down the interview. James went back to the evidence.
He got warrants.
He searched Bennett's apartment, his car, his locker at work. They found nothing. No physical evidence connecting him to Sophie. No blood. No DNA. No trace that she'd ever been in his vehicle. Nothing. But James's gut told him Bennett was involved. 22 years of experience, hundreds of cases solved, and his instincts were screaming that this was their guy. The timeline fit. The behavior fit. The lack of an alibi fit. Everything fit except the one thing that mattered most, hard evidence. Days turned into weeks. Sophie's case was all James could think about. He stopped going to his daughter's basketball games. He barely spoke to Lisa. He'd come home after midnight and leave again before dawn. He was obsessed, consumed by the need to find Sophie and bring her home. His captain pulled him aside on day 19. The conversation was uncomfortable. The chief was getting pressure from above. The clearance rate was suffering. Other cases were piling up. The department needed a win, needed to show the public they could protect their kids. The unspoken message was clear. They needed to close this case. James knew Bennett was guilty. He could feel it in his bones. But feelings don't hold up in court. He needed evidence, something concrete, something that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. He went back to Bennett's apartment one more time. The landlord let him in, grumbling about how many times the police had already been through there. James walked through the small space slowly, methodically, looking at everything with fresh eyes. The living room was messy but unremarkable. The kitchen had dirty dishes in the sink. The bathroom was cramped and needed cleaning. Then James opened the bedroom closet. He'd searched it before, of course, multiple times. They all had, but there in a shoebox on the top shelf tucked behind some old papers, he found it. A silver bracelet, delicate, distinctive, with a small heart-shaped charm. James had seen it in photos 100 times. Sophie's grandmother had given it to her on her 15th birthday. Sophie wore it every single day. Her mother had mentioned it specifically when she first reported her daughter missing. James stood there holding the bracelet and felt his hands start to shake. This was it. This was the evidence he needed. With this, they could arrest Bennett. They could get a conviction. They could finally give Sophie's family the answers they deserved. But something was wrong. Something that made James's chest tighten with a feeling he'd never experienced in his entire career. A feeling that threatened to tear apart everything he believed in. This closet had been searched. Multiple times. By multiple officers, including him. They'd been thorough. They'd photographed everything. They'd gone through every box, every shelf, every corner. So how had they all missed a bracelet that was sitting right there in plain sight? James stood in that apartment holding Sophie's bracelet and felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. His mind raced through every possibility, every explanation, but none of them made sense except for one. One terrible, impossible thought that he didn't want to accept. Someone had planted this bracelet. He went back through the search reports in his head. Day 6, they'd done the first search. He remembered it clearly. They'd gone through that closet shelf by shelf. They'd photographed everything. Day 12, they'd come back with a more detailed warrant and searched again. Nothing. Day 17, another team had done a follow-up search. Still nothing. And now, on day 23, suddenly this bracelet was just sitting there in a shoebox like it had been there all along. James felt sick. If someone had planted evidence, that meant everything was compromised. The case would fall apart. Bennett would walk free. And Sophie's family would never get justice. But more than that, it meant someone in his own department had crossed a line that should never be crossed. He should have called it in right then, should have reported his suspicions to Internal Affairs, should have started an investigation into how this evidence appeared. That's what the rules said. That's what his training said. That's what 22 years of doing things the right way told him to do. But James looked at his phone. 63 missed calls, most of them from Sophie's mother, who called him every single day, sometimes multiple times, asking if there was any news. Any updates, anything that could give her hope that her daughter was still alive. 23 days. Every hour that passed made it less likely they'd find Sophie alive. The statistics were brutal and everyone knew it. The first 48 hours were critical. After that, the chances dropped dramatically. They were way past that now. James thought about Bennett sitting in his lawyer's office, smug and protected, knowing they didn't have enough to charge him. He thought about Sophie, wherever she was, whether she was scared or hurt or worse. He thought about all the cases he'd solved, all the families he'd helped, all the times he'd gotten justice for people who couldn't get it themselves. And he thought about what would happen if he reported his suspicions about the planted evidence. Internal Affairs would launch an investigation. The defense would have a field day. Bennett's lawyer would get everything thrown out. Even if Bennett was guilty, even if he'd taken Sophie, he'd walk free on a technicality. And they might never find out what happened to her. James stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes. 2 minutes that would change everything. 2 minutes where he made a choice that went against every principle he'd built his career on. He bagged the bracelet. He documented finding it. He called his captain and said they finally had the evidence they needed. He told himself it was the right thing to do. Bennett was guilty. James knew it. The bracelet just confirmed what he already knew to be true. Maybe another officer had planted it. Someone who was trying to help. Someone who was just as frustrated as James was about the lack of evidence. Maybe it didn't matter how the bracelet got there because Bennett deserved to be arrested anyway. But even as James told himself these things, even as he filled out the paperwork and processed the evidence, he knew the truth. He'd compromised. He'd looked the other way. He'd become the kind of cop he'd spent his whole career trying not to be. The arrest happened fast. With the bracelet as physical evidence, they had enough for a warrant. Bennett was taken into custody, processed and charged. His lawyer screamed about planted evidence, about police misconduct, about a rush to judgment. But nobody listened. The bracelet was real. Sophie's DNA was on it. The chain of custody was documented. The trial took 3 months to get to court. During that time, James barely slept. He'd wake up in the middle of the night sweating, replaying that moment in Bennett's apartment over and over. He became short-tempered with his daughters, snapping at them over little things. Lisa knew something was eating at him, but he couldn't tell her. Couldn't tell anyone. He kept working other cases, kept going through the motions, but nothing felt right anymore. Every time he processed evidence, every time he interviewed a witness, every time he made an arrest, he thought about that bracelet, about the choice he'd made, about the line he'd crossed. The trial itself was quick. The prosecutor built a strong case. The bracelet was the centerpiece. Sophie's mother testified, breaking down on the stand when she identified it as her daughter's. The jury saw Bennett's criminal history, heard about his lack of an alibi, saw the evidence of the bracelet found in his possession. Bennett's defense attorney argued that the evidence was suspicious, that the timeline didn't make sense, that there was no other physical evidence connecting his client to Sophie's disappearance. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw a man with a violent past and a teenage girl's bracelet hidden in his closet. The verdict came back in less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, Bennett was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sophie's parents hugged James outside the courthouse, thanking him through their tears. The mayor held a press conference praising the department's work. The captain called James into his office and shook his hand, saying he'd done excellent work under tremendous pressure. The local news ran stories about justice being served. James accepted all of it with a smile that felt like it was carved into stone. People called him a hero. They said he'd gotten justice for Sophie. They said he'd made the city safer. But James knew the truth. He'd built his entire career on integrity, on doing things the right way no matter how hard it was, on never compromising his principles. And when it mattered most, when the pressure was highest, when everything was on the line, he'd failed that test. He'd made one choice, just one, a choice to look the other way, to trust his gut over his training, to prioritize the outcome over the process. And he was about to learn that one choice, one moment of weakness, one compromise of principle could destroy everything. Because the truth has a way of coming out, always. And when it did, the cost would be higher than James could have ever imagined. 6 months after the trial ended, James got a call that would shatter his world completely. The call came from Indiana State Police on a cold Tuesday morning. James was at his desk, going through case files, when his phone rang. The detective on the other end introduced himself and asked if James had a few minutes to talk about a case. Something about the man's tone made James's blood run cold. They'd arrested someone named Robert Chen 3 days earlier. Chen was 42 years old, a long-haul truck driver who'd been living a double life for years. He'd killed 2 teenage girls in Indiana, and when they searched his property, they found something that made them call Detroit immediately. Chen had photographs. Dozens of them. Trophies from his victims, the detective explained. Girls from different states, different years, and one of those photographs was of Sophie Miller. James couldn't breathe. The detective kept talking, but the words sounded like they were coming from underwater. Chen had confessed to everything. He'd given details about Sophie's abduction that were never released to the public. Details that only the real killer would know. He'd described what she was wearing, what she said, where he'd taken her. Chen had buried Sophie's body in a wooded area about 200 miles from Detroit. He'd kept the bracelet as a trophy initially, but then when the investigation started heating up and he saw Bennett's face on the news, he'd planted it in Bennett's apartment to throw the police off his trail. Chen had worked as a delivery driver in the same industrial area as Bennett's warehouse. He had access. He knew Bennett had a record. It was the perfect setup. The Indiana detective was still talking, saying something about coordinating with the FBI, about recovering Sophie's remains, about how they'd need James's help with the case. But James had stopped listening. Tyler Bennett was innocent. An innocent man had been sitting in prison for the last 6 months because of evidence that James knew deep down might have been planted. Evidence that James had chosen to use anyway because he was so sure he had the right guy. So sure that his instincts were correct. So convinced that Bennett was guilty that he'd ignored every warning sign telling him something was wrong. James ended the call and sat at his desk, staring at nothing. His hands were shaking. His whole body felt numb. Everything he'd feared, everything he'd pushed down and tried not to think about for 6 months, was suddenly real and unavoidable. He'd helped convict an innocent man. Not because he'd lied or planted evidence himself, but because he'd seen the signs of planted evidence and chosen to ignore them, because he'd let pressure and exhaustion and his own certainty override everything he knew about proper procedure, because he'd made one choice to look the other way, and that choice had destroyed an innocent man's life. James walked into his captain's office and told him everything. About finding the bracelet, about his suspicions that it had been planted, about choosing to process it anyway because he was so sure Bennett was guilty, about compromising everything he'd built his career on in one moment of weakness. His captain's face went pale, then red, then pale again. The fallout started immediately. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation. The media got hold of the story within hours. The detective who'd solved hundreds of cases, who'd been praised as a hero just 6 months earlier, was now the face of everything wrong with law enforcement. The headlines were brutal. Police misconduct, wrongful conviction, innocent man imprisoned, justice system failure. Bennett was released after 183 days behind bars. 6 months of his life gone. He'd lost his job, his apartment, his relationship with his family who'd believed he was guilty. He came out of prison a different person, angry and broken and traumatized by an experience he should never have had to endure. Sophie's parents were devastated all over again. Not only had they lost their daughter, but the man they'd believed was responsible wasn't even the right person. They'd directed all their grief and anger at Bennett for 6 months, convinced justice had been served only to find out they'd been wrong. And Sophie's real killer had been free that entire time, able to hurt other families. The department terminated James immediately. No ceremony, no goodbyes, just a letter informing him that his employment had been ended for professional misconduct and failure to follow proper procedures. 22 years of service erased, the pension he'd been counting on for retirement gone, the badge he'd carried with pride surrendered. Bennett sued the city for wrongful imprisonment. James had to testify at the depositions, had to sit across from a man whose life he'd helped destroy and answer questions about every decision he'd made. Bennett's lawyer tore into him, and James didn't defend himself. What could he say? He'd made the wrong choice. He'd known something was wrong and proceeded anyway. The worst part was facing his family. His daughters looked at him differently now. The man they'd admired, who they'd thought stood for justice and integrity, had been revealed as someone who'd compromised his principles when it mattered most. His older daughter, who'd wanted to be a lawyer, started talking about becoming a defense attorney specifically to protect people from cops who cut corners. Lisa stayed with him, but things were different between them. She'd ask him why he didn't tell her what was happening, why he'd carried that burden alone for 6 months. He didn't have a good answer. Pride, maybe. Shame. Fear. All of the above. James couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. The local news had run his photo so many times that strangers would stop and stare. Some would confront him, calling him corrupt, saying he represented everything wrong with police. Others would look at him with pity, which somehow felt worse. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. When he did sleep, he dreamed about that moment in Bennett's apartment, about holding that bracelet, about making a different choice. He'd wake up sweating, replaying the scene over and over, wishing he could go back and do the right thing. The community he'd served for over 2 decades wanted nothing to do with him. The youth basketball program asked him not to come back. Speaking invitations were canceled. Friends stopped calling. He'd become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when cops think the ends justify the means. James had spent 22 years building something solid, a reputation, a legacy, a career based on doing things the right way. And in one moment, under impossible pressure, he'd made one choice that brought it all crashing down. But the story wasn't over yet, because James had to decide who he was going to be next, whether he'd run from what he'd done or face it head on, whether this mistake would define him or whether he'd find some way to make it mean something. James could have disappeared, could have moved to another state, changed his name, started over somewhere nobody knew his face or his story. A lot of people in his position would have done exactly that. Run from the shame, from the judgment, from the constant reminder of the worst mistake they'd ever made. But James couldn't run. Not because he was brave, but because running felt like making the same mistake all over again, taking the easy way out instead of facing the hard truth. He'd already done that once, and look where it got him. So he stayed. And he did something that most people thought was crazy. He started showing up to city council meetings, community forums, anywhere people were talking about police reform and wrongful convictions. And he told his story not to defend himself, not to make excuses, but to be a living, breathing example of how good intentions and certainty and pressure can lead good people to make terrible choices. The first few times were brutal. People yelled at him, called him names, told him he had no right to be there, no right to speak. One man, whose son had been wrongfully convicted years earlier, stood up and told James that he represented everything that was broken about the justice system. James didn't argue. He just listened. And when the man finished, James said, "You're right, and I'm sorry. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure people learn from it." Slowly, painfully, James started to find a new purpose. He reached out to organizations that worked to overturn wrongful convictions. Most of them hung up on him or ignored his emails. But one organization, a small nonprofit called the Justice Project, agreed to meet with him. The director was skeptical. She'd seen too many disgraced cops trying to rehabilitate their image. But James wasn't asking for redemption or forgiveness. He was offering his skills. 22 years of investigative experience, intimate knowledge of how police departments worked, understanding of what could go wrong in investigations. He volunteered to review old cases for free, to look for the same red flags he'd ignored in Sophie's case, to help identify where investigations might have gone wrong. He knew how evidence could be mishandled, how tunnel vision could blind detectives, how pressure could make people cut corners. His first case was a man named Kevin Torres who'd been convicted of armed robbery 8 years earlier. The evidence had seemed solid at the time, but there were inconsistencies that nobody had followed up on. James spent 3 months working on the case, tracking down witnesses, finding security footage that had been overlooked, documenting every problem with the original investigation. When Torres was finally exonerated and released, he came face to face with James. The moment was tense. Torres knew James's story, knew what he'd done, but he also knew that James had just given him back his freedom. Torres didn't thank him. He just nodded once and walked out. That was enough. James worked on 7 more cases over the next 2 years. 5 of them resulted in overturned convictions. 5 innocent people who got their lives back, at least partially. It didn't balance the scales. Nothing could do that. But it was something. He also started speaking at police academies. Not everyone wanted to hear from him. Some departments refused to let him through the door, but others, particularly progressive chiefs trying to reform their departments, saw value in his story. James would stand in front of rooms full of young recruits and tell them exactly what he'd done. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to justify it. He described the pressure, the certainty, the moment of choice, and the devastating consequences. He'd watch their faces as they realized that the guy telling them this story wasn't some corrupt cop who'd been taking bribes or planting evidence for years. He was someone who'd spent over 2 decades doing good work before making one terrible decision. You're going to face moments like this, he'd tell them. Cases where you're sure you have the right person, but the evidence isn't quite there. Situations where your captain is breathing down your neck and the media is demanding answers. Times when taking a shortcut seems like it would serve justice better than following the rules. He'd pause and make eye contact with as many of them as he could. That's when you have to remember that the rules aren't there to make your job harder. They're there to protect innocent people. And the moment you convince yourself that you can ignore them because you're certain you're right, you become part of the problem. I don't care how good your instincts are. I don't care how much pressure you're under. The system only works if everyone follows it, especially when it's difficult. His relationship with Tyler Bennett never recovered. James reached out several times, trying to apologize, trying to explain. Bennett's lawyer told him to stop calling. Bennett himself never responded. James understood. Some things you do to people can't be fixed with apologies. Bennett had to live with the trauma of 6 months in prison for something he didn't do. That was James's burden to carry, but James did testify in Bennett's lawsuit against the city. Unlike many cops who would have protected themselves in the department, James told the complete truth. Every detail of what he'd done wrong, every choice he'd made, every warning sign he'd ignored. His testimony helped Bennett win a settlement that at least provided some financial compensation, even though money could never truly make things right. His daughters eventually came around. It took time and a lot of difficult conversations. His older daughter did become a defense attorney, and she was good at it. She called him sometimes to ask about police procedures, about how investigations worked. It wasn't the relationship they'd had before, but it was something. She told him once that watching him face what he'd done and try to make amends had taught her more about integrity than all the years of watching him be a perfect cop. Lisa stayed through all of it. There were times James told her she should leave, that she deserved better than being married to the guy everyone pointed at as an example of failed justice. She'd just shake her head and remind him that marriage meant sticking around for the hard parts, not just the good ones. James never got his badge back, never got his reputation back, never stopped being known as the detective who'd helped convict an innocent man. That was his reality now, and he'd accepted it, but he also became something else. A voice for reform, a reminder of what could go wrong, a person who'd made a terrible mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to prevent others from making the same one. He couldn't give Tyler Bennett back those 6 months, couldn't erase Sophie's parents' pain, couldn't undo the damage to the justice system's credibility. The consequences of his choices would echo for the rest of his life and beyond, but he could stand up and say, "I failed. Here's how. Here's why. And here's what we need to do to make sure it doesn't happen again." That honesty, that willingness to be the cautionary tale, was the only form of redemption available to him. James had built his career on justice. He'd destroyed it with one mistake, and now he was spending whatever was left of his life trying to build something different. Not a legacy of perfect cases and commendations, but a legacy of accountability, honesty, and the hard truth that even good people can fail when they compromise their principles. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined, but it was the one he'd earned, and he'd spend every day left making sure it meant something.